Christians believe that all will be raised from the dead. But is a resurrection even possible? That's what we'll be discussing tonight. I'm Jordan. This is the Analytic Christian, the channel where we help you explore Christian philosophy and theology. So, my guest is Dr. Eric Yang, and I've had him on a couple times previously, and one of those was on the Trinity. However, tonight we're focusing on resurrection. So, good to meet you again, or good to see you again, Dr. Yang.
Thanks for having me on again, Jordan.
All right. This discussion is based on a chapter in a book that you co-authored with Stephen Davis. Do you have that book in front of you? I didn't ask you this beforehand. I don't have it in front of me right now.
Yes.
Yes, Christian Philosophical Theology. So, highly, highly encourage you to get this book. It's a super solid introduction to a bunch of topics that we discuss on this channel. So everything we're saying in this interview, you can get more in depth if you check out that chapter and the footnotes in it and so on. All right. Well, let's start by, I guess, if you don't mind, can you just briefly describe what we even mean when we talk about like all will be resurrected? Like what's that idea trying to communicate?
Yeah, so the resurrection is the view with regards to what will happen to us human beings after death, after perhaps some future state, personal destiny, what God has planned for us. And so the idea, anastasis or resurrection, is that our bodies, which will die, will rise again. So presumably that means they will come back to life. But more than just coming back to life a la zombies, at least not philosophical zombies, but movie zombies, is that they are going to be glorified. They're going to be special. They're going to be such that they will not be perishable. They will be imperishable, incorruptible. They'll have other special features, the kinds of features that we see in Christ's resurrected and glorified body.
Very good.
What happened to Christ, we expect, is what will happen to us at some point, perhaps in the future.
Now, the view that one takes about their resurrection, like how it works, will in some ways depend on their view of human persons. So, what are some views of human persons?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's common to distinguish between dualism and materialism. And there are different types of dualism. So to be more precise, a substance dualism and materialism. So typically substance dualists will say one of two things. First, they might say that human persons are immaterial substances. So we might call these souls. So these non-physical objects that are the literal subjects of our beliefs, desires, pains, tickles, and so forth. But another very common version of dualism will say that we are a composite of the immaterial soul and a physical body. So those are parts of me. And for those who endorse this latter version, they typically say the soul is an essential part of me and the physical body is a contingent part of me. So that's a pretty common way of thinking about human persons. You see this perhaps in Augustine and Descartes and arguably in Plato. We've got some contemporary philosophers who endorse this, such as Richard Swinburne would hold the composite version. Contrast that to what we might call materialism. Now we have to be careful because materialism can mean lots of different things out of the mouths of different people. So it might mean an inordinate desire for wealth and possessions. That's not what we mean. Christians should be opposed to that. It might mean that there are no supernatural entities. Again, Christians have to be opposed to that. All we mean by materialism regarding human persons is that human persons are material objects. Now that leaves it quite broad because the question then is, well, which material object are you? So common answers might be that we are animals. So I am identical to this animal. Another common answer is say, I'm just my brain. Some have what we might call fancier answers. They might say, I'm a person that is constituted by the animal. So I'm distinct from the animal, but I bear this special constitution relation to the animal. So those are the kinds of common answers. this is not exhaustive. There are views regarding human nature distinct from dualism and materialism, but dualism and materialism, broadly speaking, and especially in the West, seem to be the dominant positions.
Good. So, what is the difference between a two-stage view and a three-stage view of the resurrection?
Yeah, so that's the terminology that I use in the chapter from the book that I just showed. That's not standard terminology, I should note off the bat. When I teach this material, so I teach a course at my university entitled Death, Afterlife, and Meaning of Life, and we examine different conceptions of life after death, reincarnation, resurrection. So when I teach this material, I kind of use this two-stage, three-stage view as a heuristic device for my students, but it's not sort of some technical term that's common in the literature. But the way I think about it is, if you want a traditional conception of the sequence of what happens to Christians in their life, death, and afterlife, is what I'm calling a three-stage sequence. So this three-stage view has the first stage, which is our current pre-mortem life, so our life right now before we're dead. And then after we die, there's this intermediate or interim state. And what exactly is happening in that intermediate and interim state, it might depend on what sort of background that you have. You might think it's maybe a period of purgation, or maybe it's a time where you are just waiting around happy with God. Whatever the case is, it's this interim period that's not the final end. And so after some period of time, then your body will be resurrected and glorified. Typically, it's associated with the return of Christ, and then that's how you'll be forever. So that third stage, the glorified resurrected stage, is the presumably permanent stage of that will happen, world without end. That's the three-stage view. However, there have been some Christians who have rejected the intermediate state. And so I labeled this the two-stage view. So in this kind of approach, you have our current pre-mortem life, and then when you're dead, you're gone, you cease to exist. And then at some point in the future, perhaps in the future, I keep saying perhaps in the future, because as we'll see, there's some views that say maybe the resurrection is not the future, but the hyper future or something like that. But presumably sometime in the future, there will be your resurrected body. So you'll come back into existence. And so you only have two stages, the pre-mortem life and the resurrected life, no intermediate stage. So that's why I call that the two-stage view.
Good. Yeah. So up front, we're just trying to lay out some key terms, and we're coming very quickly to the 5 models. There's going to be 5 models that we discussed tonight. So before we get to the first model, one more term that we need to keep in mind, and that is numerical identity. Will our resurrected bodies be numerically identical to the bodies we have at death? That's a question that each model is going to have to give an answer to. And what do you think? What are some reasons to think the answer is yes, and what are some reasons to think the answer is no?
So the models that we'll be examining during this interview will be ones that say, yes, the resurrected body will be numerically identical to our current bodies. But do they have to be? So at least these days, Christians seem to say both no and yes. I think historically, it's been much, much more common to say that, yes, the body will be numerically the same. But there have been some Christians who said, no, it will be a numerically distinct body. Now everyone agrees that the resurrected body will be qualitatively different. It's going to have qualities, however you want to construe that. Aquinas had some extra qualities like impassibility, agility, subtlety, clarity. Whatever the case is, it's going to be very cool in the way that Christ's body was very cool. So that, for example, the quality of subtlety is the quality that allows Christ to walk through a wall. So apparently the resurrected body would have something like that, but you don't have to accept that view of the glorified resurrected body. But with regards to numerical identity, some people have said no, the resurrected body will not be one and the same as the current body. Well, why not? Well, for one, it is really, really hard to see how a resurrected body can be restored when the original body is destroyed or when the original body ceases to exist. And presumably, when your body dies and it decays into humus, it ceases to exist. Once something is gone, how could you bring it back? Some people think it is impossible. So, on that basis, some reject the claim that the resurrected body will be identical. Additionally, there are some who are dualists, or what I was calling the Constitution. When I was talking about that Constitution version of materialism, they said, look, you don't need the same body in order for you to persist. As long as you have your soul, or as long as you have your first person perspective, then you can continue to exist. So if persistence doesn't require your body for you to exist, and God wants to just preserve your existence, he doesn't need to give you a body. And then you might ask, well, why then have any body at all? And someone might say, well, embodiment is good. Perhaps even though you don't need this body to continue to exist, having a body is the way that we are supposed to be. And so God will endow all of us with new glorified bodies. Okay. That said, lots of Christians, especially historically, have said that's not correct, that the resurrected body will be identical to our current body, right? Numerically identical, qualitatively different, but numerically identical. And that's so even by historical theologians who were dualists. So Augustine counts as a dualist, or I think he should count as a dualist, and yet he thought that the resurrected body would be numerically identical to this, right, to our original bodies. So I think that we should assume that the resurrected body is numerically identical to our original bodies. Some people have said, well, if you don't have a numerically identical resurrected body, then it's not really distinct from reincarnation, right? It just seems like reincarnation, you get a new body. What's the conceptual difference? Now, I don't think that that's very persuasive. I don't think that that's even right, but some people have given that kind of claim. Others have argued and said, well, yes, embodiment is good. The Christian tradition says God created matter. He saw that it was good. He wants us to have bodies. And some have tried to argue and said, if embodiment is good for us, then it has to be this very body. So some people have given that argument. Others have gone maybe a little bit more metaphysical. They said, well, first, again, let's ask, what are we? Well, if we're some material object, say this animal, then in order for God to bring us back, God has to bring this animal back, right? So this living body, if that's what I am, in order for me to exist, then God has to bring this very living body. Some of these reasons I don't find persuasive. That last one I'm very, very sympathetic to. But I think the main reason why Christians should believe that the resurrected body will be numerically identical to our original bodies is because of Christ's resurrection. So Christ, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, is the first fruits of the resurrection. And I take that to mean that Christ's resurrection is the model of what our resurrection will be like. After all, we share in his resurrection. So since the body, Jesus's body that went into the tomb, was numerically the same as the body that came out, I think that's what's going to happen to us. So whether dualism or materialism is true, given Christ's resurrection as the model, I think that gives us very good reason to believe that the resurrected body will be identical to our current body.
Good. All right, now we're going to get into these 5 models. And I'll just list these out really fast, and we're going to discuss each one in more depth. The first is going to be resurrection by reassembly. The second is the body snatching model. The third is the falling elevator model. The fourth is the anti-criterialism model. And the fifth is the hypertime model. Okay, so let's start with resurrection by reassembly. Explain this model to us.
Yeah, so this model goes way back. Several early Christian thinkers, including Augustine, seem to endorse this approach. And at least at first glance, it's very intuitive, right? The thought would be, well, your body dies, it dissolves. To bring the body back, gather all of the pieces, gather all the parts, and reassemble them. We already seem to have that intuition. So, for example, if I had a watch and I took it to a repair person and they took the watch apart, all of its parts, had it strewn across their desk, and a week later it's just scattered. And then 7 days later, they come back, they reassemble it, and they hand it back to me and go, they say, here's your watch. Is it the same watch? Well, some people will have the intuition, yeah, it's the same watch. They use the exact same parts, put it back in the exact same arrangement, so that's the same watch. Okay, so presumably that won't be hard for God, because even though our parts might scatter, let's say our fundamental particles might scatter, God, being omnipotent and omniscient, would be able to fish for them, gather them together, reassemble them in the way that they were, and voila, we brought your one and the same body back. Okay, do you want me to talk about problems?
Yeah, I want you to go into some problems.
Yeah, this approach of recent times has become like the whipping. Oh, that's a horrible metaphor. So it's been the model that everyone starts out with and then says that they reject and mocks and does horrible things or says horrible things about it.
I'll mention a funny anecdote on that point. So I did an interview with Trenton Merricks on
Yeah,
the resurrection, and he doesn't have this model,
yeah,
but
that's right.
he brought it up for the purpose of what you're saying. Like initially, you might think something like what this model says is correct, but then he says, but there's many problems with this, and I told him that I would be interviewing somebody who holds this model, and he said he looked shocked. I mean, he was like, "You mean there's somebody still around that defends this?" He just so yeah, it seems like it's not taken very seriously. I don't know.
Yeah, which is too bad, I think, because I think again the gut reaction. There's something about it that seems kind of right. The one problem though is, say, unlike watches, human bodies, we gain parts and we lose part. We excrete matter, we assimilate new matter, and so even early on, even Augustine wrestles with this. What happens if a cannibal eats you and then immediately dies? Now, of course, you might think that's a silly example, but the point of this cannibal case is that our parts can be replaced and we can share parts with other people. So there's this question, when God decides to resurrect us, which parts is God going to use? Is God going to use all the parts, right? Let's just say the fundamental particles, if there are fundamental particles, so the quarks, leptons, and whatever. Will God use all of those fundamental particles that made you up right at your death? Well, if so, it's possible that all the particles that made you up right at your death also made up someone else in the past right up at their death, say Macrina, right, the sister of Basil Zasiri and Gregor of Nyssa. So Macrina dies, there's all her parts scatter, and then at some point they eventually find their way, make it to you, and then you die. But at the moment of death, it happens to have all of the fundamental particles that exactly overlap the ones at Macrina's death. And then God's trying to decide, okay, I need to resurrect you and I need to resurrect Macrina, but shoot, it's all the atoms are being used up, so I need to be able to resurrect both of you, since presumably everyone will be resurrected, and yet I can't resurrect you both. Okay, so that seems to be the problem here. So that's what the cannibal case, I think, is trying to push. Now, there's a kind of obvious response here, which would be, well, maybe God doesn't have to use the fundamental particles that made you up right at death. Maybe God could use the particles that made you up at any point in your life. So that seems to be a reasonable response. But there's an obvious problem here. The first person I know that made this objection is Peter Van Inwagen. This is, okay, well, we know that your body is constantly replacing parts, and presumably every 7-ish years, all of the fundamental particles are being swapped out anyway. So the collection of particles that make you up now are different than the ones that made you up 10 years ago. Okay, well, suppose that you die, and then God decides to gather all the particles that made you up right at your death, and to gather all the particles that made you up 10 years ago, reassembles them, and voila, it looks like you have two Jordans. So they're both equally good candidates of being you, but they can't both be you, so neither are you. Now, again, the point here is God's not going to be tricky in this kind of way. The point is supposed to be gathering parts and reassembling them is not sufficient for your continued existence. So this account is not going to work with regards to being good grounds for what makes you persist. Another main challenge to this, and this is probably maybe why Trenton Merrick's brought it up, because this is one thing that his view shares with the resurrection by reassembly view, is that they allow for what are called temporal gaps. So if you have a sort of the career of your existence, there's a period in the middle, so to speak, where you don't exist. So question, if you go out of existence, or if an object goes out of existence, can it be brought back into existence? Can there be this kind of existential discontinuity? So some people, again, Van Inwagen thinks, no, it can't be. And so here's an adapted case that we use in the book. So suppose I have this baseball signed by Hank Aaron, this very, very valuable baseball. And then suppose I drop it into a fire and it gets burned, it's into ashes. Pious person that I am, I kneel down, I pray to God, I say, Lord, that was such a valuable object. Can you please restore it? And voila, from the ashes, they all start to come together and they start to form this ball, and you start seeing this imprint of the signature Hank Aaron. Okay, question is this the same baseball? The one before it was destroyed, is the baseball restored by God numerically identical to that one? And some people have the intuition that it's not. It's a distinct baseball. In fact, that signature is not Hank Aaron's signature. It's a forgery by God. So you have a distinct ball. So the idea is supposed to be then you can't have temporal gaps. And if you go out of existence, there's no way for you to be brought back. Or if a body goes out of existence, there's no way for it to be brought back. So some people think that's a serious problem for this model. Oh, I should note, yeah. So there are recent sympathizers. Dean Zimmerman has a piece where he doesn't endorse it, but he sympathizes with it. Justin Mooney has a paper where he seems to endorse it, and at least a modified version. And Steve Davis and I, the person I co-wrote that book, we wrote a paper trying to give a sort of revised or modified version of resurrection by reassembly. We don't endorse even the modified version, but we don't think that resurrection by reassembly is as silly as some people thought it was.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'll be having Justin on in 2 weeks, I think, to summarize his paper on resurrection by reassembly. So look forward to that. All right, let's go to the second model, the body snatching model. First of all, that's just like a cool, it sounds like some, epic, I don't know, crime detective show or something, like it's like an episode of Sherlock Holmes or something, the body snatching model. So yeah, what is this model?
Yeah, so this one comes from Peter Van Inwagen, and he developed this. I think he developed this even before he was a Christian, and then later when he became a Christian, kind of elaborated a bit on what he was thinking. And to be sure, he does not think this is how God is actually going to do it, right? This is not, he doesn't think this is how God is going to actually resurrect us. He's just trying to show that it is possible, that there's nothing impossible about bringing back a numerically identical body. Okay, so he was concerned with this idea of a temporal gap that resurrection by reassembly seems to permit. And it's because he thinks there's got to be some kind of continuity, the right kind of continuity that holds, so in order for you to persist, maybe something like spatio-temporal continuity or something like that. So what can God do to resurrect you while still preserving spatio-temporal continuity? Well, he thought, well, perhaps, say, right at death, or maybe right before death, God snatches your body and immediately replaces it with a perfect duplicate. So it's qualitatively indiscernible, right? It's a distinct body, but you can't tell it apart. And he takes your body and preserves it somewhere, right? So somewhere, God has lots of resources in our gigantic universe, so God can preserve your body. And then the perfect duplicate is the one that gets cremated or buried. It's the one that people will mourn over at the funeral. And then at the resurrection, God is going to take your well-preserved body and restore it and glorify it and soup it up with all the cool glorified attributes. So that's how resurrection is maintained, because that spatiotemporal continuity is maintained because your body is going to be well preserved.
So what are the objections to this model?
Yeah, there's one objection that people keep bringing up with regards to this one, which is that it makes it seem as though God is being deceptive. He's being a trickster in maybe a problematic kind of way. So, in what way is God being a trickster? Well, when we go to the funeral or when we cremate the body and we're looking at the body, we think, oh, this is that body. There's the hand I once held, right? There are the lips that I once kissed. This is the body that I once hugged or something like that. So you think it's the same body as the original one, but it turns out it's not. A perfect duplicate has been swapped in its place. And so people are forming false beliefs about this particular corpse. And so this looks like a kind of systematic deception because it's happening every time somebody dies. And the thought is, does that make God a kind of deceiver that would be problematic, right? It would go against God's moral perfection or perfect goodness or something along those lines.
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. I guess the weirdest thing about that view, and it's just a complaint about it's weird, is God storing these bodies somewhere on some, who knows where, how. Like, that
Yeah.
just seems kind of strange that he's got this big collection of bodies.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe someone would say, well, that's just your incredulity, Jordan. But
Yeah.
uh, I don't know. That seems weird.
Yeah. Elsewhere, Van Inwagen does posit that it may not have to be the whole body that God snatches. Maybe there's some part of the body that is, when taken, is enough to preserve you or preserve that body. So he alludes to 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about a naked kernel. And so perhaps that's all that God takes. And so instead of this like storage building of all these corpses, it's just a slightly smaller, but still very, very large storage unit of all of these naked kernels that are there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that mitigates the weirdness, but
Yeah. I don't I don't know. It doesn't seem to mitigate it to me that much. But all right. Moving on now to the falling elevator model. What's this model?
yeah, this one's great. So this one comes from Dean Zimmerman. Is a brilliant philosopher, and he is either a dualist or is a strong sympathizer with dualism. But he also writes in ways where he's very materialist friendly. So he rejects materialism, but he seems to be throwing a bone to materialists on many occasions. And he was trying to work within the metaphysical framework of Van Inwagen's view. So given those kinds of constraints, so if you take Van Inwagen's metaphysics of human persons, within those constraints, how can the body be brought back without utilizing the body snatching view? Because he was also concerned with that for reasons that we just mentioned. So he came up with this model. He called it the falling elevator model because it's supposed to be akin to, if you remember those cartoons and somebody's falling in an elevator, and the way that they survive is right before it crashes, you jump out. So right, obviously this couldn't happen given our physical laws, but at least in the cartoon world, as it's falling, if you can jump out, you can be saved from the crash, right? So at the last second. Okay. So that's the kind of, this like jumping out is the kind of picture that he has in mind. So here's what he thought. He said, perhaps right before death, God can endow all of the particles that make you up, and God could cause them to, or He can have these powers such that they will fission. They'll split. So every particle will split, and so what you end up having are, these two successor particles, and so you'll have two successor collections of particles. One of those collections will compose the corpse that's right there, where right before it's at that location right before you died. But the other collection of particles will jump into the future, say whenever the resurrection occurs, and will be alive and well. Okay, so now you've got two potential candidates for being you because of the split. You've got the corpse and you've got the future living body. But the corpse is not a viable candidate. It's dead. In fact, under Van Inwagen's view, it's not even a single unified thing. It looks like it's one thing, but it's just a collection of particles, right? It's particles arranged corpse-wise, so it's not a viable candidate. So there's really then one successor that can be you, which is the future jumped body, and so there's a way in which you can survive. You can survive your death if God has all of your particles splitting in this kind of way.
Okay. There is a problem a big one that comes up for this model. So explain that problem.
Yeah, so this is a big debate in metaphysics with regards to personal identity, or with respect to diachronic identity or identity across time generally. And it's this. Some people call it the only X and Y principle. So that principle says if X is identical to Y, then their identity cannot depend on anything other than the intrinsic features of X and Y. It can't depend on anything outside of X and Y, so to speak. And people seem to think this principle is correct, because how can what happens to me at some future time depend on what happens to you, or what happens to Biden, or what happens to any other person aside from future me and right now me? So let's go with the falling elevator case, where my particles split and now there's this corpse. That's a collection of some of my successor atoms and the living body that jumped into the future. But we're saying right now that that future body is identical to the original body, but had the corpse survived, which it very well could have, God could keep it alive, then if that corpse survived, then I could, given that I can't be identical to two distinct things, or the original body can't be identical to two distinct bodies, then that the resurrected jumped body would not be identical to the original body. So whether or not that identity holds between the resurrected body and the original body depends on what happens to the corpse. And some people think that just can't, that can't be the case. That can't hold. So for those who hold to that kind of principle, this view is a non-starter.
What it really helped me, I guess, feel the grip of this objection was when I did an interview with Timothy O'Connor, who bases his model of resurrection off of the falling elevator model, but he takes into account this problem and basically develops his model in such a way that it avoids this problem. But when he was explaining the problem, what helped me grasp the force of it was, he said, "Okay, Jordan, imagine that you've got this body, and then it fissions, not in so that now you've got the corpse and then this body here, but it splits so that you've got the corpse and then two bodies. Now, which one's going to be you?" And that, I don't know. I think before I was like, well, of course I'm not going to be the corpse. That thing's dead. Like, I'm going to go on. I'm going to be the living one. But yeah, when it was, no, you've got a corpse, but that thing fissioned right, like split second before death, so that now you've got two bodies plus that corpse. Which of these two fully suitable candidates for bodies? Which one's going to be you? And it seems like it would be totally arbitrary for me to say that one. You know, so that that made me feel the force of it.
That's right.
Did you want to say anything else about that problem, or like how I mentioned that Timothy O'Connor's developed a solution, but
Yeah, so I've been working on a model that doesn't violate the only X and Y principle, but I'm actually not sure if it's true, and in part because of my co-author and good friend Steve Davis. So his account of persistence requires having God's will as a necessary condition for our persistence. God has to will that we continue to exist, and that would be something extrinsic. And when we first started hanging out and chatting, I was strongly opposed to it, but perhaps by osmosis and just hanging out with him, I'm less opposed to it. So I don't think I accept that there are these extrinsic conditions, but I'm less hostile to them than I once was.
got it. Okay. What you all developed that in the paper that you mentioned on
So he developed that initially when he wrote this book on resurrection 30 years ago. I think I was still in high school when he wrote that book. So it's been a while. But then we were trying to take that idea and develop a theory of composition to make sense of resurrection by reassembly. So it's still going to involve sort of an extrinsic account of persistence and an extrinsic account of composition.
Mhm. All right, let's move to the fourth model. We're doing pretty well on time. We've got at least one question in the live chat, but please, if you've got questions, go ahead and start putting them in the live chat. Just put the word question at the beginning. Makes it easy for me to find it. Okay, so the fourth model, which I don't know if you want to say it's a model so much, but it's what is this anti-criterialism account?
Mhm. Did you talk about this with Trenton Merrickx when you interviewed him?
Yeah, so the reason I said it's not really like a model, the way that it seemed to be used in Trenton Merrick's in the interview with Merrick's was it's almost like I guess I'm thinking of it, and this may be incorrect. I'm thinking of it like almost a defensive kind of maneuver. Like there's a person saying resurrection's impossible, and it's like, oh well, why? Why is it impossible? Tell me. Give
Mm,
me some like criteria
mm,
that you think have to be met in order for there to be a resurrection, and then I'll just give you a counterexample to it,
mhm,
so that that criteria um, doesn't work. So I may be incorrect about that idea, but yeah, you. So I don't see it so
mhm,
much as like, here's what the resurrection's going to be like. It's more like you haven't been able to show me that a resurrection can't happen.
mhm.
Am I
I
right
see.
about that, or am I way off?
So I'll let him speak for himself, and you can have him back on. Um, Maybe that's how it comes off when he's talking about the resurrection, but he actually holds to this view with regards to thinking about identity across time for not just human persons, but for any object. Um, and he tries to develop this sort of this metaphysical framework where identity across time does not we can't provide any informative, necessary, and sufficient conditions. We can't provide a criteria for it. And so he defends this elsewhere. So it's not as though he's just trying to like dodge bullets and
Mhm.
sort of, give these ad hoc responses. He does develop a metaphysical framework by which he wants to advance this anti-criterialism. So, as a few states, there are no criteria for art persistence. What that means is there are no informative, necessary, and sufficient conditions. So you could give necessary and sufficient conditions, they just won't be informative. They won't really tell us. They won't be explanatory. Right? We sometimes in our definitions or philosophical definitions or in analyses, we want some kind of metaphysical explanation, and there's not going to be one forthcoming if they're necessary and sufficient. Or you might give some informative ones, but they won't be necessary and sufficient. All right. So maybe a simple way of putting it is, therefore, we're not going to find any deeper explanation for identity over time. Right? So all these other accounts are trying to give some deeper explanation, and he wants to say there isn't a deeper explanation. So there's no more to
Mhm.
say than what we have, that this is identical to that. Okay. And you know, you can see why someone might be sympathetic. We need some primitives. We need some concepts that are just basic for us. And wouldn't identity, right, that equal sign. Wouldn't that be about as basic or primitive as you can get? So if this is right, then you could still use criteria as evidence. So we can use spatiotemporal continuity, we could use memory or other psychological connections as evidence, but they're not going to be what we might call like the metaphysical grounds for identity across time. The upshot to his view then is you don't have to bother with all of these other models that are trying to find some account for explaining how the person persists. And another upshot to his approach is it doesn't rule out temporal gaps. So it in fact permits temporal gaps. So you can go out of existence, or your body, he thinks you are this living body. So when it dies, you go out of existence, but that God can bring you back, because the ultimate end for Christians is in the resurrected stage. So God will bring you back through resurrection. And so his model would fit with what we were calling the two-stage theory.
Yeah. So I'll encourage the viewer, go check out that interview with Dr. Merrick's. I definitely think, yeah, as you described that, for sure by the end of our discussion, he makes that point that you're making. And I think he uses electrons, I think he talks about, like, imagine a single electron.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, I can't remember the point in full detail. It's been a few weeks since I've listened to it, but it was something like, if that was all that existed, it's like this single electron, like at a single point in space or something, like, what would make you think that 1 second later that's the same electron?
Mm-hmm.
The electron 1 second later at that same exact point is identical to the one previously. What would be the criteria, maybe, was, I think, the point. And I think he wanted to say, like, there's just, like, what could you say to that? There's not really anything. I think he gives the example of, like, God could be annihilating the one electron and then replace one
Mm-hmm.
right the second after it, and then annihilate that one and replace it again. But it would have all the same properties, everything. So, like, what could you possibly say to say this is the same identical electron as the one
Mm-hmm.
before? And I think he wants to say, like, there's just nothing less. There's nothing to say there.
Well, I think what he'd want to say is, so you've got these two cases. They're indiscernible from our perspective. One where there's a persisting electron, the other one where there's a replaced but qualitatively indiscernible electron. From our perspective, it looks exactly the same, but the cases are just different insofar as one involves the same one, another one doesn't. Well, what's the difference? It's not going to be spatiotemporal continuity. So the difference is just in the first case, the fact that it is identical. So I don't know if he would like this kind of language. So some people have used the language of there being a further fact over just the properties and relations that hold. And so identity might just be one of those further facts. Right? So that's and there's no deeper explanation for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this last model, the hypertime model.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I just find hypertime, as I definitely don't know much, but what little bit I do know, I'm, like, fascinated by it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, explain this model, the hypertime model.
Yeah, and I should note, you said last, so there are several other models. I'm currently working on an account based upon my view of human nature. So there are many other models that are out there, but this one's great. And I wanted to include it because Hud Hudson is just one of my favorite philosophers, current philosophers. He just, the way that he writes, the way that he thinks. And so this is great. His stuff in metaphysics and stuff on space and time and hyperspace and hypertime has just been really, really interesting and great, and well versed with contemporary science and especially contemporary physics. So what in the world is all this hypertime stuff? Some philosophers, not just Hud, but some philosophers have said we have to include it in our ontology, as part of reality in toto. And they've given arguments. Maybe we need hypertime in order to make sense of the passage of time, right? So if we say time flows, we could ask, well, how fast does it go? And maybe saying it goes 1 second per second sounds nonsensical for some people. For some people, others, it's not a problem. But some people said that's weird. So you have to say maybe it's 1 second per hypersecond or something like that. So you can make it a little bit more intelligible, the passage of time, by appealing to hypertime. Others have said, well, maybe to make sense of the possibility of changing the past, right? So if time travel is possible, it doesn't seem possible to change the past. And people have these, like, the so-called grandfather's paradox. It says it's impossible to change the past. But others have had the intuition, maybe it's not impossible, and it perhaps is not impossible if you posit hypertime. Okay, I'm not gonna get into that. Anyways, what HUD wants to do is say, well, where in the world is the resurrection happening? Yes, the tradition is to say that it's going to happen in the future in our universe. And let's just suppose, as he does, to think that this view known as eternalism is true. So all moments of time, past, present, and future, are equally real. So we could think of reality as this huge 4-dimensional space-time block. Okay. Well, hypertime will be sort of a temporal plane above our own time. You could think of it as another temporal dimension, right? So ergo hyper, right? Above. So it's above our own temporal plane. And there are going to be different hypertimes. It's going to be time-like, so there are going to be different hypertimes, and different hypertimes can have different content. So our entire universe, right, the whole of our universe, past, present, and future in this space-time block, could be the content of a single hypertime, right? It just takes up one hypertime. Everything that happens in the universe takes up one hypertime. Okay, and then other hypertimes will have, say, perhaps distinct space-time blocks. Okay, here's just the rough and ready of this. Well, instead of saying that our resurrection will happen in the future, perhaps it will happen in the hyperfuture, in some hypertime, and therefore it won't be happening within our own universe, within our own 4-dimensional space-time block. No matter how far you go into the future, that's not where it's going to happen. And he likes this because he thinks, look, some of our best scientists say that the universe is going to die a heat death. And yes, an omnipotent being could restore it all, but this is just the way that the natural order is going. But God can perhaps resurrect your body or resurrect you and some other space-time block that occupies a distinct hypertime. So your resurrection is not future, but hyperfuture. So really interesting proposal. He doesn't, at least where he wrote this, he doesn't seem to endorse it, but at least consider it as a very, very plausible model, perhaps a model better than the other ones. Of course, it does require accepting hypertime, and there are philosophers who think that we shouldn't posit hypertime. So it's going to depend upon that very heavy-duty metaphysical thesis.
Okay. So I guess I was thinking a moment, actually, I don't know if I asked you to identify any problems with the last model, and I don't think I've asked you to identify problems with this model. So maybe, yeah, if you want to jump back and identify problems with the anti-criterialism account, and then also maybe problems for this hypertime model.
I take it that the problems will just be with regards to the metaphysical debates that are happening, even independent of thinking about the resurrection. So against the anti-criterialists, there'll be the criterialists who say, no, persistence, you can give a criteria. Zimmerman has called folks anti-criterialists like these identity mystics. And he sort of raises some problems. Recently, a really great philosopher, Matt Duncan, has tried to argue pretty forcefully against anti-criterialism to say, there are grounds. Right? We should opt for believing that there are grounds to our persistence, that there's some kind of deeper explanation for what makes us be the same. But again, these are metaphysical debates independent of the resurrection. And then again, with hypertime model, I'm just like debating about time is just very, very complicated. And should we even say that time flows? And if we say that time doesn't flow, then that's at least one reason not to endorse hypertime, maybe we should say that we can't change the past. So you might undercut reasons for opting for hypertime, or you might say there's something maybe problematic for hypertime. Does hypertime flow? Well, then if hypertime flows, then do you need hypertime? And then does hypertime flow? And then do you end up with an infinite regress? So again, these are sort of like metaphysical debates happening that make it tough to advance these models that rest upon contentious metaphysical theses.
Yeah, Justin Mooney, he's watching, and he had an interesting comment just now.
We're Facebook friends, and I think he's Dr. Mooney now. So congratulations, Dr.
Yes,
Mooney.
I should say Dr. Mooney. Yeah. So Dr. Mooney mentioned this. Going back to the point about Christ's resurrection as a model of ours, Christ's resurrection wasn't hyper-temporal. So that may count against this model, because our whole reason, well, you had said like one of the major reasons for the Christian to affirm that the body will be numerically identical, the resurrection body will be numerically identical to their pre-mortem body was, that's the way it was in Christ's case, and he's the first fruits. But if that holds, if that's a good reason to think the body's got to be numerically identical, then that's going to count against this model.
Yeah, so I still haven't yet met Justin in person, so I'm hoping that will happen one day. That will be rectified. But he seems to always interact whenever I'm on your show, and he always has really, really brilliant things to say. So yeah, this is good. So you might think, well, Christ's resurrection happens in this, space-time block, so won't that happen for ours? I'm very, very sympathetic with that. So I do not think the resurrection will happen in the hyper future. I think it will happen in our future. Maybe because I like the narrative of it. I like the thought that not just our bodies, but the entire cosmos, the entire universe has to be made right again. But there's just kind of loveliness to that. But let me just push back. I'm not sure if we can say that Christ's resurrection wasn't hyper-temporal. Yes, he was revived, and we could say even resurrected. But there might be some hyper future, so some other space-time block where there's Christ's resurrected body. And so that's it's compatible with Christ coming out of the tomb in this space-time block with saying that Christ also has a resurrected body in some hyper future. And so we might say Christ's resurrection is a hyper future event. So again, I'm not endorsing Hudson's view, but I can imagine him saying, oh, so we can't just say that ours won't be. Christ has a this worldly resurrection and perhaps a hyper future resurrection, whereas we will only have a hyper future resurrection. So just because it happened to Christ doesn't mean that everything that happened to Christ will happen to us. What we do know is that he was resurrected, we will be. If resurrection will be a hyper future event, it could have been for Christ. We just don't know since we're confined to this space-time block.
All right, so we're about to go to questions and wrap up. Before we do, I'm going to ask you one more question, and that is concluding the discussion. So if you can fit this conclusion into 60 seconds, I'll probably make it its own video. But yeah, I guess if somebody said, how is a resurrection even possible? What might you say? Because I feel like that's what this whole interview is about. Like, how can you get a real resurrection?
Yeah, that's great. So, like the subtitle of our book, which is a traditional Christian motto, faith seeking understanding, I believe in the resurrection of the body because of divine revelation. But now we want understanding, and we do want to ask, how is it possible? Because it does seem like if bodies cease to exist, they can't be brought back. And curious minds, I think, will want to know. And trying to think hard about this will require thinking about what we are and how we persist over time, what time is like, what material objects are like, how the parts of an object are related to the whole, and all of these other philosophical questions. Now, you might think, is this just an exercise, a ivory tower exercise? Well, I don't think so. There have been non-religious authors, very, very smart thinkers, who have declared that the resurrection is impossible. And so if you believe in it, you're irrational. One of my favorite philosophers, Eric Olson, has done this. He's written really great pieces that say you shouldn't believe in the resurrection. It's not possible for bodies to be brought back. So by advancing a case that shows that the resurrection is possible, we are addressing some of these challenges, and we're showing that what we as Christians believe is not irrational. I think that's an important thing to communicate to the culture, that we are not believing irrational things, that we are rational in what we hold. Nor do I think it's good for us to just jump too quickly to mystery. I mean, I get that impulse. We're not going to fully understand it. God's resources outstrip our own conceptual resources, but we're not dealing with the Trinity here. I understand jumping to mystery with the Trinity. That's dealing with God, and God is transcendent and wholly other. But with the resurrection, we're talking about us. We're talking about our bodies. We're talking about what makes us the same over time. And yes, while we don't fully understand it, I'm hesitant to just jump to mystery as a fix all for that. Um, so my hope is that this was a helpful way of thinking through how it can be possible and addressing charges that we're being irrational and believing something that's impossible. And we're trying to say, no, it is possible. And we've got some resources to explain how it can be so.
Excellent. That was a good summary. Okay, we're going to go to questions. Put your questions in the live chat, please. We've already got a couple there. I'm going to grab them. While you're putting your questions there, I'll mention this. Please, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. If you've watched a bunch of my videos and you benefit from them, please consider becoming a patron. That's going to allow me to invest more of my time into making content. I really want to do that. So becoming a patron will help me do that. Also, by becoming a patron, not only do you get early access to videos and you get to join the private Facebook group, but you also automatically get to be in the TAC book club. Right now, we're reading through Hud Hudson's book, A Grotesque in the Garden. And hopefully, who knows, we may be able to get him on and you'd get to meet him. But even if not, we have other philosophers in the group that I'm sure you'd be excited to interact with. So lots of good things for you to enjoy if you become a patron. The link to become a patron is in the description of the video. All right, let's go to your questions. So it looks like Tim asked, does 1 Corinthians 15, he says 1 Corinthians 15, 38 through 40 suggests that every human, righteous or not, is going to receive an imperishable body by virtue of belonging to humankind. Does that contradict annihilationism?
Does 1 Corinthians 15, 38 to 40 suggest that every human person is going to receive a body? I'm not sure that the verses there say that every single one in an unrestricted way is going to receive a body. I believe that, so I am not an annihilationist. Jordan, I think I remember you saying that you are or sympathetic to it.
Yeah.
But that said, so I don't remember the verses offhand, but I don't recall it using some kind of universal quantifier. And even if it does, is it unrestricted? Does it apply to every single person? I don't know. And there are some verses where it does seem like there's a universal quantifier employed, but it could be restricted. And I assume that annihilationists will want to say that it is there restricted. So, annihilationists, at least as what little I've interacted with them, they've thought through these passages. There's no like sneak surprise Bible passage that they haven't thought of. They read the Bible, and they've come across these passages, and they're doing their best to interpret them, and to interpret them in a way that says that not everyone is going to be resurrected. So there's that. Now I believe that everyone will be resurrected, both the saved and the damned. But
Yeah, I do too. So the annihilationist wants to say, or at least I guess the camp that I'm familiar with wants to say everyone's going to be resurrected, not just believers. Everyone's going to be resurrected. It's just that the lost,
it won't last forever.
They won't last forever. There's going to be a second death, as Revelation puts it, and so they will have a second death. But yeah. So what I may do, Tim, actually, I may ask my friend Chris Date to leave a comment on this video, and I'll tell him like this time point what Chris says is that 1 Corinthians 15, when it's speaking of like imperishable bodies and that sort of thing, it's speaking only of believers. So only the believer gets an imperishable body, not the unbeliever, though the unbeliever will be resurrected. So I'll ask him to put a comment explaining that interpretation, and maybe he can interact with what you've said there. One point that I'm interested in, so I heard this in an interview recently. It's not really relevant which interview, but in that same chapter, 1 Corinthians 15, I can't remember the exact verse. Let's see if I can find it. But it's basically like Paul rhetorically asks, oh, yeah, here it is. This is verse 35 of 1 Corinthians 15. Paul asks, but someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? And then the next verse he says, how foolish. So what do you think about that? I heard someone recently mention like the kind of discussion we just had was total foolishness according to 1 Corinthians 15, because Paul anticipates this kind of question. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, this is good. And I've seen people try to use Paul as a sort of critic of philosophy, say in Colossians or maybe in something like this, where it seems like we shouldn't be asking. But if we're going to do good biblical exegesis, we need to ask, well, what's Paul trying to do? And in First Corinthians, he's trying to address these factions, these Christian groups, these factions that are fighting amongst each other, saying that we're better than you because we're of Peter, we're of Paul, we're of Apollos, we're of Jesus. And they're engaged in really heinous moral behavior. They're doing pretty badly, so to speak, morally. They're suing each other. They're sleeping around. They're being arrogant with regards to certain practices, like eating, squabbling about eating meat served for idols. So, and they're one-upping each other with their spiritual gifts. So that's what Paul's primarily trying to do. And so a lot of them are trying to show just how smart they are. They're trying to say, look, we're smarter than them because we have spiritual gifts of knowledge and speaking in tongues and prophetic powers and teaching. And I think Paul's trying to slam some of them down and humble them and say, you think that's really great? That's actually not that great. Love matters way more than any of these spiritual gifts. And that what we care about at the end isn't getting it all right and showing how smart we are. It is the real fact that death has been defeated, not eliminated, not removed as a process, but its sting has been taken out. And now it's a process by which it becomes a portal where we will one day be with God face to face. So we can kind of mock it and say, where's your victory? Where's your sting? I think that's what Paul's trying to do in 1 Corinthians 15. So it is a caution for people who are trying to one up each other in how smart they are. And that is just something that any Christian intellectual or anyone who thinks hard should remember. But I don't think, if we're being careful in exegesis, that it's saying you can't think about these kinds of questions in the context of what they were doing in thinking about these questions and trying to one up each other. They shouldn't care. They should care about what it means for them, which is the defeat of death. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. So I don't see it as license of you can't ask. And the reason why, and you say, well, how can you say this? Because Paul does philosophy, especially in, say, Acts 17, in the Areopagus, where he's quoting Stoics. And I would argue that in other letters, including the ones that are regarded as legitimate Pauline letters, employ philosophical tools and argumentative skills. So I think he's doing it. We just have to remember that's not the point of this all. Getting the right model of the resurrection isn't the point of thinking about it. The point is for us to address these challenges when we're talking about it, but the ultimate point of the resurrection is for us to celebrate that death is not the end. It doesn't have final victory. Therefore, our sin doesn't have final victory over us. And that's worthy of celebrating. We celebrated that on Sunday because of Easter, and we're supposed to be celebrating that for the next several weeks. So I don't think it's a slam on philosophy rather than a slam on intellectual pride.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the live chat. So we're going to wrap it up there. It's about a little over an hour anyway, so that's pretty good time. So thank you so much, Dr. Yang, for joining me again. I love having you every time, and this was no exception.
Well, thanks for having me on, Jordan.
All right. Hopefully we see you back again. And thanks everyone for watching. Go and check out the interview that I mentioned with Trenton Merricks. That's on the anti-criterialist model. I also, if you become a patron, you have access right now to my interview with Dr. Timothy O'Connor on that emergent individuals model, which was based on the falling elevator model. And then, as I mentioned, next week, no, I'm sorry, in 2 weeks, I'll be interviewing Justin Mooney on the resurrection by reassembly model. So that way you can go and explore these models in more depth. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.